spooky place.
Next time you drive alone on a stormy night, be careful who you offer a ride. You might not be the only one in the car when you reach your destination. Some passengers never leave because they were never really there to begin with. Sleep well tonight if you can. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The Stranger in the Rain. The storm raged with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural. Thunder roared like a beast in the distance, and the rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the road into a shimmering black mirror. The wind howled through the trees, their branches clawing at the sky as if trying to escape the earth itself. It was the kind of night where the world felt alive, but not in a comforting way, more like it was watching, waiting. John gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge, and the headlights barely pierced the gloom. He was exhausted, having worked a double shift at the hospital, and all he wanted was to get home to his warm bed. But the storm had other plans. As he rounded a sharp bend in the road, his headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder. John slowed, squinting through the rain. It was a man, drenched to the bone, his clothes clinging to his thin frame. He was shivering violently, his arms wrapped around himself, as if trying to hold in what little warmth remained. The man's face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes, wide and hollow, locked onto John's as the car approached. John hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep driving, to leave the stranger in the storm. But something about the man's desperate expression tugged at him. Against his better judgment, he pulled over and rolled down the window. "Hey, you need a ride?" John called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. The man didn't respond. He simply stared, his eyes unblinking, before shuffling toward the car. John reached over and pushed the passenger door open. The man slid into the seat, water dripping from his clothes and pooling on the floor mat. He didn't say a word, didn't even nod in thanks. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his breathing shallow and uneven. John glanced at him, uneasy. "You okay, man? You look like you've been through hell." No response. The man's lips were pressed into a thin line, his hands resting limply on his knees. John shrugged and put the car back into gear. The sooner he dropped this guy off, the better. "Where are you headed?" John asked, trying to break the oppressive silence. The man finally spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Maple Lane, number 17. John nodded and entered the address into his GPS. The route would take them deeper into the countryside, where the houses were few and far between. The storm seemed to grow even more intense as they drove, the rain hammering against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. The trees lining the road swayed violently, their shadows dancing in the headlights like specters. The silence in the car was suffocating. John tried to make small talk, but the man remained mute, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the windshield. The only sound was the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the occasional crack of thunder. After what felt like an eternity, the GPS announced their arrival. John pulled up to a small, weathered house at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. The windows were dark, and the porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in a long time. "This it?" John asked, glancing at the man. The man nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed ahead. John waited for him to get out, but he didn't move. The air in the car grew colder, and John's breath came out in visible puffs. He shivered, his unease deepening. "Well, here we are," John said, forcing a smile. "You take care, all right?" The man finally turned to look at him. His eyes were darker now, almost black, and his face seemed to have aged decades in the span of a few seconds. His lips parted, and he whispered a single word, "Thanks." John's blood ran cold. The man's voice was wrong. It echoed, as if coming from somewhere far away. Before John could react, the man opened the door and stepped out into the storm. John watched him walk toward the house, his figure fading into the rain like a shadow. Shaking off the strange encounter, John put the car in reverse and began to back out of the driveway. But something made him stop. He couldn't explain it, but he felt compelled to make sure the man got inside safely. He parked the car and grabbed an umbrella from the back seat, then hurried up the crumbling steps to the front door. He knocked, the sound echoing hollowly through the house. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. An elderly woman stood there, her face lined with age and sorrow. She looked at John with tired eyes, her expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice trembling. John hesitated. Yeah, I just gave a ride to a man. He said he lived here. He was soaked. Looked like he'd been out in the storm for hours. I just wanted to make sure he got in okay." The woman's face paled, and she took a step back, clutching the doorframe for support. "Well, what did he look like?" John described the man, his pale face, his hollow eyes, his drenched clothes. As he spoke, the woman's hands began to shake, and tears welled in her eyes. That was my son," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But he died 10 years ago, on this road, a car accident." John's heart stopped. He stared at her, his mind racing. "That's impossible. I just saw him. He was in my car." The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Every year, on the anniversary of his death, people report seeing him. They pick him up, just like you did, but he never makes it home. He just disappears." John's stomach churned. He turned and looked back at his car, parked in the driveway. The passenger seat was empty, but the puddle of water remained, glistening in the dim light. He felt a chill crawl up his spine, and the storm seemed to close in around him. "I'm sorry," the woman said softly. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." John stumbled back to his car, his mind reeling. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The storm raged on, and in the rearview mirror, he thought he saw a figure standing in the road, watching him go. He never drove that way again. But sometimes, on stormy nights, he would wake to the sound of rain and the faint echo of a voice whispering, "Thanks." And he would know, deep down, that he hadn't been the only one in the car that night. John tried to put the encounter out of his mind. He told himself it was just a trick of the storm, a combination of exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere playing tricks on him. But no matter how much he rationalized it, the memory of the man's hollow eyes and the old woman's trembling voice lingered like a shadow in his mind. Days turned into weeks, and life returned to its usual rhythm. But strange things began to happen. Small, inexplicable occurrences that chipped away at John's sanity. It started with the car. No matter how many times he cleaned it, the passenger seat was always damp, as if someone had just been sitting there soaked from the rain. The smell of mildew crept into the upholstery, and no amount of air freshener could mask it. Sometimes, when he was driving alone, he would catch a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, a fleeting shadow in the back seat. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Then there were the dreams. Every night, without fail, John found himself back on that desolate road, the storm raging around him. The man was always there, standing by the side of the road, his pale face illuminated by the headlights. In the dreams, John would pull over, and the man would get in, just like before. But this time, he would turn to John, his black eyes boring into his soul, and whisper, "You shouldn't have stopped." John would wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of rain still echoing in his ears. One night, after a particularly vivid dream, John decided he couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers. He grabbed his coat and drove back to Maple Lane, determined to confront the old woman and put an end to the madness. The house looked even more decrepit in the moonlight. The storm had passed, but the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. John knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. After a long moment, the door creaked open, and the old woman appeared, her face gaunt and her eyes sunken. "You," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You came back. I need to know what's going on," John said, his voice trembling. "That man, your son, he's haunting me. I can't sleep. I can't think. I need to know why." The woman stared at him for a long time, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. Finally, she stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. The inside of the house was as cold as a tomb. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and the walls were lined with faded photographs of a young man, her son. John recognized him immediately. It was the man from the road. His name was Daniel, the woman said, her voice breaking. He was only 22 when he died. He was coming home from work that night, just like you. But the storm, it was too much. He lost control of the car and crashed into a tree. They said he died instantly. John felt a chill run down his spine. "But why is he haunting me? I didn't do anything to him." The woman shook her head. "It's not you he's after. It's the road. That stretch of highway, it's cursed. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, Daniel appears to those who pass by. He's trapped, you see. He can't move on, and he's not the only one." John's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" The woman led him to a window and pointed out into the darkness. "Look." John peered through the glass, and his breath caught in his throat. The road was no longer empty. Dozens of figures stood along the shoulder, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. Some were drenched, as if they had just stepped out of the storm. Others were mangled, their bodies twisted and broken. They all stared at the house, their expressions filled with longing and despair. "They're all souls who died on that road," the woman said. "They're trapped here, just like Daniel. And every year, they try to find a way back. But they can't, not without help." John turned to her, his heart pounding. "What do they want?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "They want someone to take their place, someone to free them." Before John could respond, the lights in the house flickered and went out. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with the scent of rain and decay. John spun around, his heart racing, and saw Daniel standing in the doorway, his black eyes fixed on him. "You shouldn't have come back," Daniel whispered, his voice echoing through the room. John backed away, his mind screaming at him to run. But the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The other figures began to appear, their ghostly forms materializing out of the darkness. They reached out to him, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. "Take my place," Daniel said, his voice a haunting melody. "Set me free." John's vision blurred, and he felt himself being pulled into the darkness. The last thing he saw was the old woman's tear-streaked face as she whispered, "I'm sorry." The next morning, a passing motorist saw a car parked on the side of the road, its engine still running. Inside, they found John, slumped over the steering wheel. He was alive but barely conscious, his skin ice cold and his eyes wide with terror. When they asked him what had happened, he could only whisper one word, "Daniel." John was never the same after that. He quit his job and moved away, but he could never escape the feeling of being watched. Every time it rained, he would hear the faint sound of footsteps outside his window, and the smell of mildew would fill his car. And on the anniversary of that fateful night, he would see them, the figures standing by the side of the road, their hollow eyes pleading for release. He knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him again, because on Maple Lane, the dead don't rest. They wait, and they hunger. John thought moving away would save him. He left the town, changed his number, and even sold his car, hoping to sever all ties to that cursed night. But the dead have a way of finding you, no matter how far you run. Months passed, and the nightmares grew worse. The figures from the road began appearing in his dreams more frequently, their faces twisted in agony, their voices a cacophony of whispers. "Take my place," they would say, over and over, until John woke up screaming. He tried therapy, medication, even hypnosis, but nothing worked. The curse had its claws in him, and it wasn't letting go. One evening, as John sat alone in his new apartment, he received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just his name scrawled in shaky handwriting. Inside was an old, leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with entries written in a frantic script. As John flipped through it, his heart began to race. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas Hargrove, who had lived over a century ago. The entries detailed a series of strange and terrifying events that had occurred on the same stretch of road where John had picked up Daniel. Thomas wrote about hearing whispers in the wind, seeing shadowy figures at the edge of his vision, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread every time he traveled that road. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1923. I can no longer deny the truth. The road is alive. It feeds on us, drawing us in with its illusions. I have seen them, the lost souls, trapped in an endless cycle of despair. They call to me, begging for release. But I know the truth. To free one, another must take their place. I cannot bear this burden any longer. Tonight I will end it. John's hands trembled as he read the words. He turned the page, but the rest of the journal was blank, except for a single sentence scrawled on the very last page in fresh ink. "You're next." John slammed the journal shut, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Who had sent this to him? And why now? Before he could think too deeply about it, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You can't run forever. The road is calling. Come back." John threw his phone across the room, his mind racing. He couldn't go back. He wouldn't. But as the days passed, the pull grew stronger. It was as if the road itself was summoning him, its voice a low, insistent hum in the back of his mind. He tried to resist, but the nightmares became unbearable. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. He was a shell of his former self. Finally, on the anniversary of that fateful night, John gave in. He drove back to Maple Lane, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The storm was back, just as fierce as it had been that night. The rain lashed against the windshield, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. As he approached the spot where he had picked up Daniel, his headlights once again caught a figure standing by the side of the road. It was Daniel, his pale face illuminated by the light, his hollow eyes staring straight into John's soul. John pulled over, his heart pounding in his chest. Daniel got into the car without a word, just as he had before. But this time, he turned to John and smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent a shiver down John's spine. "You came back," Daniel said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "I knew you would." John didn't respond. He couldn't. His mouth was dry, his throat tight with fear. He drove in silence, the storm raging around them. When they reached the house on Maple Lane, Daniel got out and walked toward the door. John watched him go, his mind screaming at him to drive away, to leave this cursed place behind. But he couldn't. He was drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. He followed Daniel to the door, his footsteps heavy with dread. The old woman was there again, her face pale and her eyes filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice trembling. "Now it's too late." Before John could respond, the door slammed shut behind him. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. John spun around, his heart racing, but Daniel was gone. The old woman was gone. He was alone, or so he thought. The whispers started then, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. They came from all around him, filling the air with their haunting melody. "Take my place," they said. "Set me free." John stumbled through the darkness, his hands outstretched, searching for a way out. But the house seemed to stretch on forever, its walls closing in around him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were deafening. And then he saw them. The figures from the road were there, their ghostly forms materializing out of the shadows. They surrounded him, their hollow eyes filled with a desperate longing. John tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was trapped, just like them. Daniel appeared in front of him, his face twisted in a grotesque smile. "It's your turn now," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. "Take my place." John felt a cold hand grip his arm, and then another and another. The figures pulled him into the darkness, their icy fingers digging into his flesh. He tried to fight, but it was no use. They were too strong. As the darkness consumed him, John realized the truth. The road wasn't just cursed, it was alive, and it had chosen him. The next morning, a passing motorist saw a car parked on the side of the road, its engine still running. Inside, they found John, slumped over the steering wheel. He was alive but barely conscious, his skin ice cold and his eyes wide with terror. When they asked him what had happened, he could only whisper one word: Daniel. John was never the same after that. He quit his job and moved away, but he could never escape the feeling of being watched. Every time it rained, he would hear the faint sound of footsteps outside his window, and the smell of mildew would fill his car. And on the anniversary of that fateful night, he would see them, the figures standing by the side of the road, their hollow eyes pleading for release. He knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him again, because on Maple Lane, the dead don't rest. They wait, and they hunger. John's life became a living nightmare. No matter where he went, the whispers followed. The figures from the road haunted his every waking moment, their hollow eyes staring at him from the shadows. He tried to end it all, but every attempt failed, as if the curse wouldn't let him die. He was trapped in a purgatory of his own making, a prisoner of the hollow road. One night, as the anniversary of his encounter with Daniel approached, John received another package. This time, it was a small, ornate box with a note attached. "The only way out is through. Bring this to the road at midnight." Inside the box was a strange, ancient-looking key. It was cold to the touch, and when John held it, he felt a surge of energy, a dark, malevolent force that made his skin crawl. He didn't know what the key unlocked, but he knew he had no choice. The road was calling him back, and this time it wasn't asking. At midnight, John stood on the hollow road, the storm raging around him. The key felt heavy in his hand, and the whispers were louder than ever. The figures began to appear, their ghostly forms materializing out of the darkness. They surrounded him, their hollow eyes filled with a desperate hunger. Daniel stepped forward, his face twisted in a grotesque smile. "You've come to set us free," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "But freedom comes at a price." John held up the key, his hand trembling. "What do I do with this?" Daniel pointed to a large, ancient oak tree at the edge of the road, the same tree John had seen in his nightmares. "The key unlocks the gate," Daniel said, "but be warned, once it's open, there's no turning back." John walked to the tree, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, he saw a small, hidden door carved into the trunk. It was covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. He inserted the key and turned it, the sound of the lock clicking open echoing through the night. The ground beneath him began to shake, and the storm grew even more intense. The door creaked open, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness. The figures from the road began to move toward it, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and terror. But as they passed through the door, John realized the truth. The vortex wasn't a gateway to freedom. It was a gateway to something far worse. The road wasn't just cursed. It was a prison for something ancient and malevolent, something that fed on the souls of the lost. The figures weren't being set free. They were being consumed. John tried to close the door, but it was too late. The vortex began to pull him in, its dark energy wrapping around him like a vice. He fought against it, but the force was too strong. As he was dragged into the darkness, he saw Daniel one last time, his face twisted in a grotesque smile. "You should have never stopped," Daniel said, his voice a chilling whisper. "Now you'll take our place." John screamed as the darkness consumed him, his body and soul torn apart by the vortex. The door slammed shut, and the storm suddenly ceased. The road was silent once more, the figures gone, but the curse wasn't over. The next morning, a passing motorist saw a car parked on the side of the road, its engine still running. Inside, they found a man slumped over the steering wheel. He was alive but barely conscious, his skin ice cold and his eyes wide with terror. When they asked him what had happened, he could only whisper one word: "John." The man had no memory of how he got there, or who he was, but he knew one thing. He was drawn to the road, to the ancient oak tree with the hidden door. And as the storm clouds gathered overhead, he felt the whispers begin, calling him back to the hollow road. Because the curse was never about setting the lost souls free. It was about feeding the darkness, and the darkness was always hungry. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.